Greetings, brethren and sisters. This is Gillie Priest, and welcome to Gillie Priest Revolutionary Radio. Today is going to be a second part series dealing with establishing the Rastafari Worldwide Seminary. And when we commenced the last episode I put up, we dealt with the Tabernacle Rastafari Promise Key Seminary from this particular document. I no longer believe that it's necessary for me to identify this document, which we already identified from the last series. But suffice is basically to say it was taken from a capstone thesis that was submitted at an educational institution. And at the last session, we went through the reason given why we believe that it is necessary to establish this Rastafari seminary upon a worldwide basis, both from a brick and stone establishment as well as through the worldwide internet series. So before I continue with this document, and today we're going from this document, we're going to deal with the contextualization for the reasons and purpose of establishing this particular institution. To begin with, I'll first again like to reintroduce for those who may be coming across this for the first time, Forged by Time. And Forged by Time is basically, in essence, my autobiography of my story, where I spent 45 years incarcerated in the United States innocently based upon political reasons that allegedly commenced in Jamaica. I'm asking for the support because basically for me to keep this program going, this has to be my main source of income. That way I does not have to basically go out and seek employment that may take away from the reasons and purpose behind the establishment of Gillie Priest Revolutionary Radio. As usual, I thank you all very much for the support that I've received so far, and I'm still asking for your support going forward in the future towards this book. Before I commence with the contextualization of the Rastafari Seminary, I'd like to just basically touch upon a few things. When we speak of Rastafari, what is it that actually comes to most of our mind? What is it that it envisions to us? What is it encapsulated in our mental consciousness? Through my years of reasoning with brethren and sisters in the Rastafari movement, there is this perception that when we speak of Rastafari, we are talking about arriving at a certain point of consciousness. This is what it is to many brethren and sisters. And once we arrive at this certain point of consciousness, there is this disposition that we may have arrived at some ending point where one is able to say, because I have attained this level of consciousness, I have finally arrived at that consciousness which is identified as Rastafari. So from such a conceptualization of the movement, especially for brethren and sisters who have the tendency to reach back in the past, this attainment of the Rastafari consciousness may reach a certain point when you say, okay, you eat a certain food, you dress a certain way, you express a certain political point of view, you express a certain economic point of view, and wherefore this is Rastafari. So for a lot of brethren and sisters, there's an end point in saying Rastafari. And there's a danger to that. There's a danger when one believes that reaching a certain point or level of consciousness, one has attained that level of consciousness where one can declare themselves Rastafari, and then you plateaus out, you reach a level where you struggle now just to maintain that level of liberty through a certain acknowledgement of a certain levels of consciousness. But today we are going to try to look beyond that, to what we are going to say what a new faculty of thinking for Rastafari. And I want you to grasp that term and hold it within your consciousness for a minute. A new faculty of Rastafari. And when we speak of a new faculty of Rastafari, it can be a level and an elevation of consciousness that does not even resemble what we deem the consciousness of Rastafari for the last 100 years. It does not make the past irrelevant. It does not denigrate the level of consciousness that we once identify and call Rastafari within this dispensation for, let's say, the last 100 years. Even though we know when we're speaking of Rastafari, we are going back from the beginning of time. Because that consciousness is a consciousness to free humanity, to free up man's consciousness, where man can be basically integrate within the liberty of our life form throughout the universe. But we're going to take it piece by piece. So for example, today when we speak of Rastafari, we are able to identify a certain liberty that we may say, okay, that brethren or that sister is practicing a liberty that can be identified as Rastafari within a certain consciousness, within this dispensation. But if we go back in history a little, we can see where at one point our ancestors had reached a certain level of consciousness where they became contented, where we were able to identify it as a settled culture. And then the ancestors reinforced it with certain cultural documents, practices, visions, teachings, just to hold the consciousness of the people and the community at that particular level that was seen as, for lack of a better term, righteousness. Today we would call it a certain conscious level of Rastafari. So, and then if someone attains a level of consciousness that is identified as Rastafari at this particular level, and if that person attains that, say, randomly at the age of 20, then they spend the next lifetime trying to maintain that one level there for the next 80 or 100 years, no matter how long that he or she may live. So what we're talking about is today where the Rastafari movement has adopted a type of thinking where Rastafari can be attained at a certain consciousness level, and there is no need to go beyond that. And this level, once you reach this level, where there is not a need to go beyond that, that is where judgmental start to impose itself upon people, where this is Rasta and this is not Rasta. And if you're doing this, you're not Rasta. And if you say this, you're not Rasta. Because it is seen as you have reached a plateau level beyond which no one can go and maintain the identification of being a part of the Rastafari movement. What has contributed to that type of mentality is because we have placed the conceptualization of Rastafari within flesh and blood. Now, what do I mean by that? When you speak of you eating a certain type of food, for the common mental level, is it to maintain a certain health practice, to maintain a certain liberty and seek after longevity. For most of us, that is what we strive after. When we speak of it, when we dress a certain way, We dress a certain way where we try to enhance modesty upon the physical body. And we impose that modesty through some type of moral and ethical rules, laws, and obligation. Some of these laws and rules and were laid down centuries ago by the ancestors. So we set these parameters around our liberty, which we have come to identify as righteous liberty. And then we spend the rest of our life trying to maintain that. But that is only because we have placed liberty within the flesh and blood of the body. That is where most of us has placed the concept of life. But today I'm going to show you a new concept. For some of us, not for all of us. For some of us, a new concept. And I'm going to pose it first by a question. What if we place life within a certain philosophical concept? And this philosophical concept is imbued within perpetual studies for the rest of your life. I'm going to word it another way. What if it is, in order for someone to declare himself or herself a part of the Rastafari movement, one has to dedicate their mind to study and a mental evolution for as long as you are on the face of this earth? What if we have decided to conceptualize Rastafari within that contextual liberty? What if our religiosity, instead of it being how you dress and how you act and how you conduct yourself, what if our religiosity becomes permanent study and seeking after as much enlightenment as possible for as long as we are on the face of this earth within this particular dimension? Do you know that you can conceptualize Rastafari from that perspective? Do you know that we can conceptualize Rastafari as a seeking after, not the attainment, because none of us individual will attain, but the seeking after true liberation of the mind, free of boundaries, where we evolve our ability to think beyond these three-dimensional realms? Do you know that that is possible? Where we can break the chains of limitation in all its manifestation and evolve upon a conscious level where we are able to unshackle ourselves from all that which bounds us and flesh and blood. Yeah, man. Rastafari can be that too. And Rastafari is that. But most of us are settled for that which appeals to the flesh and blood in order to identify it as Rastafari, so we can place judgment upon it. Because if and when you can free the mind, where your very life becomes your thinking capacity, then nothing can chain you to this earth. Nothing can bound you. You will submit to no forms of oppression by anyone. But sometimes when we try to impart this type of thinking, and it is central to one of the reasons that I did the last time, you must ask yourself, where do you place life? What is life and where do you place it? If you can develop the mental conscious level where your very life becomes one with the frequencies of the universe, upon that conscious level of thinking, nothing cannot stop you. Nothing cannot hold you, because you are one within yourself and one with all in creation. But if you segmentize yourself into a particular context and you say, this is Rastafari, and it is tied to flesh and blood, then you have bound yourself to this three-dimensional existence. You have bound yourself to this three. Who remember the Vietnam War? Do you remember the monks in Vietnam that sat in the middle? I think it was not in Hanoi. It was in the southern part of Vietnam, and poured gasoline over themselves and set themselves alight and did not flinch 1 centimeter in that fire. Do you believe an individual who carries out such a form of martyrdom did that from a perspective of flesh and blood? When me and you get a little cut with a knife, we scream, we run, we holler, we bawl. And you have a human being, an individual can sit in a composed form, pour gas upon himself and set himself alight and flinch not one bit till his very flesh and blood crumbled into ashes. That was not a physical demonstration. That was a mental demonstration, where the individual mind, within a certain encapsulation of a thinking process, became one with that person's for his life. And to bring the reason home a little closer, human being has the ability to have a body of knowledge, where that body of knowledge encapsulates the very life of that individual. Your life can be, if you choose to, be one with the way how you think. Be one with that which you know is the truth. Where that truth is life. And you master this earth. You master all things. And when you sit in front of an individual and they are looking at your flesh and blood and believe they are seeing you, all they are seeing is that which clothes the real you. You see, like one man can put on his clothes, or a woman can put on her clothes to cover her nakedness. You must learn to see that your flesh and blood is the clothing that can cover who you really are, which is your mental development to a conscious level. So your consciousness, you must learn to see your own consciousness being clothed and covered by your flesh and blood. And where that consciousness is who you really are. And learn to look at yourself as your flesh and blood as being you, covered by material garments. That is what Rastafari must strive after. Making our very essence of our existence be encapsulated within life and life-affirming things, where our flesh and blood is nothing other than like a pants and a shirt and a skirt and a blouse, which covers the flesh and blood. Our flesh and blood must be seen for what it really is. It is just that physical elemental facts that covers our mental and conscious capabilities so we can move within this 3 dimension and the face of the earth. And there is where our enslavement truly lies. Those of us who were taught and brought up to believe that our flesh and blood encapsulate our life and therefore is our life, and therefore we will submit to anything to preserve flesh and blood. And when the slave master realized that all your struggle will be is to preserve flesh and blood, because that is where you have placed life, then all the slave masters have done for the last 2,500 years is threaten your flesh and blood. Because there is where you place life. But go back through history, go back through struggles, go back as far as a century you want to go. Whenever you remove your conceptualization of life out of flesh and blood and places it within consciousness, then no man can threaten you. No man can take you prisoner. No man can enslave you. Go back in history and look how they were able to make our ancestors capitulated under certain. It was the threat to the flesh and blood. We worship this flesh and blood, and that is what imprisons us. You cannot imprison a man or enslave a man who places life within consciousness. You can only enslave and imprison a human being who places life in flesh and blood. Yeah. So that is one of what I want to open this reasoning with. And that is just to give a glimpse of where it is intended by this seminary, the Rastafari Promise Key Seminary, to take us. We are going to take our participants on a mental journey within consciousness, where we are going to reach a point where we are all going to shed our flesh and blood, because that is what chains us to Babylon. And once we have congealed enough of us to place our life upon that level of consciousness, then trust me, man, this whole earth will change. Because I will show you something, you know. It's when Babylon look at you and I, even when we are functioning within a certain level of subconsciousness and unconsciousness, and lacking consciousness of who we are, that is not how the enemy sees us, you know. The enemy sees you as a constant threat to his very existence. You do not even realize the threat that you present to this world. But I can demonstrate it to you even in the physical flesh and blood self which you have placed life. Not I, but in which you have placed life. This world cannot do without Africa. China cannot do without Africa. India cannot develop without Africa. Europe cannot maintain the status as or further develop without Africa. No nation on the face of this earth can survive without Africa. And therefore, who becomes a threat to these other people that cannot survive without Africa? You, the Africans. Look at Africa. The richest continent upon the face of the earth, but is relatively acknowledged as the poorest continent. How can you have all the mineral under your feet that the entire world needs, yet you live on the land living in poverty? The most illiterate, the most ignorant. You who walk this earth before any other people on the face of this earth, you're running around worshipping other people's gods, running around believing in other people's philosophy of life, running around carrying other people's name. Think about that, man. You see the scramble that taking place in Africa today. It was a scramble that took place 2,500 years ago. From the days of the Greek, when the Greek was running the world. 2,500 years later, here we are, still supplying Europe with raw material that they manufacture and turn into other products and sells it back to us. Triple time the price from which they bought the raw material. And all we do is running around in these fandangles. Why? It is because of where we place life. It is because of this conception that we hold to, that dictate to us what is life and what is death. And because our oppressors have dictated to us what is life, and you are bought into that concept of life, then all they do is turn around and threaten that very concept that they taught you what is life. It's like a man teaching you what is valuable and what is not valuable, and then he turns around and threatens you with what he taught you, teaches you to be as what is valuable. Think about that. Let me tell you one more thing before I get to this document. You see, the Babylonian teaches and believes in a philosophy of life. That no powers within creation must be beyond their control. So they must control the sun, the moon, the star, the weather, whatever. And that which they cannot control physically, they control it academically. They seek to control it conceptually. They leave no stone unturned. They leave no powers beyond the reach of their government and their people. So when you take the concept of God, the one that was bequeathed to us, I'm going to demonstrate something. When you take that concept of God, if you look at it clearly and keenly, it is a concept that is well in line with the capitalist economic doctrine that runs the Western world. You know. It is like a Siamese twin. I'm going to demonstrate it for you a little bit. If you study the concept, the economic concept of capitalism, it says every man is for himself. Every man has a right to preserve his own existence and that of his family. He does not care how he goes about accomplishing that versus other members of the society. So as each and every individual is responsible for his or herself within the capitalist economic system of the Western civilization, it is the same ideological doctrine within Christendom that says every man is responsible to save his own soul. You think that is an accident? That is not an accident. Individualism permeates throughout all concept of Western civilization. A man is responsible for his own individual survival on the face of the earth. That same man or woman is responsible for his own savior of his soul to go to his so-called heaven. Let's look at another part of this doctrine. In Christianity and in Christendom, it is the only religion where you can steal, murder, and plunder. Seek forgiveness from God and still keep that which you murdered and plundered and received. Every other religion upon the face of this earth that says, if you seek forgiveness for any ill will or any ill act or any ill intent that you have committed against another human being, you must return that which you had stolen in order to get forgiveness. Not in Christianity. Christianity, you can murder, plunder, steal, rape. And 1 second before the breath leaves your body, you can turn to the Christian God and say, forgive me. And you get forgiveness. And you go to heaven and you keep the stolen goods. Christianity is nothing but a capitalist religion. A capitalist moral and ethical order to protect the criminals of this earth. Come on, mathematics, simple, just look at it. Think about it. We as a people who have been murdered, plundered, raped, robbed, can sit in the same church with the same people who did it to us, underneath the same reverential structure. And you know what they tell you? You must forgive, so that they can be forgiven and they keep your property. Why you think that is so? Because you have placed life in your flesh and blood, and not in consciousness and the seeking of consciousness from the cradle to the grave. And I'm using the term cradle to the grave in terms of a Babylonian contextualization. So when we're talking about the Rastafari Promise Key Seminary, we are talking about moving away the Rastafari movement from this flesh and blood capitalization of what Rastafari is, and making it become integrated with the oneness of consciousness. That is what the Rastafari Promise Key Seminary is about. We're going to move your conceptualization of where you have placed life and what you have stated life is, and we are going to make this paradigm shift. And this paradigm shift is that which we have called the new faculty of Rastafari. The new thinking of Rastafari. That's this earth has been calling for. That old thinking of Rastafari has served this purpose. It is that which has brought us to this juncture of life. So it was necessary. But reaching this juncture of life, we have not reached the end point in this evolution of Rastafari. All the things that we had adhered to over the last 100 years and saying that this is what Rastafari is. Yes, it was necessary. It has played its part in this evolutionary process. So it was not lingered in wasted time. But we are not going to reach a certain juncture in our conscious level of development and say, at this juncture, we have reached this plateau and this is what Rastafari is. Especially when you are talking about a level of thinking of Rastafari that is embedded in flesh and blood type of thinking. No. We eat a certain particular way. We dress a certain particular way. I'm talking about in terms of flesh and blood. We think in a certain particular way that ties us in our flesh. That has taken us to this part of the juncture of our life. But we are far, far, far away in our trajectory of our conscious level of this journey we're on. This journey without and this journey within that has no end. A journey that has exhausted the pathway of flesh and blood. We have to evolve now and go on that mental level. Because remember, the mental level is what comes out of the brain. The brain itself is flesh and blood, but the brain itself, it builds a power, which is what we refer to as the mind. It's like when you look at the light, you have an electrical plant, a generator, which is physical. But when you attaches the conductors in the right and proper way, you get light. And it is this light which is the essence of all things that comes from that generator. So it is and so it should be when we speaking of the evolution of the consciousness of Rasta. We must move away from flesh and blood. We must become that body of knowledge which encapsulates Rastafari, that's dominate and control this earth. And as long as we keep buying into all these flesh and blood concepts that was bequeathed to us by Babylon, by our ancient slave masters for 2,500 years, these years coming out of the Greeks, the Persians, the Romans, the Germans, the French, the English, all these people who has imposed concept embedded in flesh and blood. Your concepts that are embedded in flesh and blood is the biggest chain around for your enslavement. Yeah. So, when we're talking about the Rastafari Promise Key Seminary, it's going to be a journey mentally. And it's going to be a journey that deals with mental capsulization, that chains to each other within that thinking capacity, where we have to develop the ability to hold concepts that are linked together in order to come into this fuller understanding. So last week I basically said when we commenced this week with the Rastafari Promise Key Seminary, we deal with the contextualization of this worldwide seminary, which is open to each and every individual upon the face, each and every African upon the face of this earth. It is open to all who seek that elevated level of consciousness in which to imbue their very existence. And some of this in the contextualization is going to sound familiar because we have touched upon it briefly in the last introductory to the seminary to the world. So I'm going to read and then give a little synopsis on it so we can move along. The purpose of this capstone thesis is to outline the aims and objectives for establishing a centralized Rastafari seminary for the following reasons: to harmonize the systematic theological content of the Rastafari movement via the distillation of the theological content of the hundreds of independently owned localized seminaries in existence in Jamaica and throughout the world effectively. Encapsulating what we have covered last week, there are thousands of Rastafari seminaries in the world. These seminaries are tied to doctrinal practices and teachings that really center around flesh and blood. That is the whole faculty. Not that it was unnecessary at that time, because that is which carries us to the point where we are at today at this juncture. It was necessary. But we cannot stop there and start to march on the one spot in time, saying this is Rastafari and our vision. Let's waste our time. Okay. So in order to do that, we have know that we must really go to the exegetical. We already defined that from the last reading. Hermeneutical, philosophical, and theological, positively address the context that gave rise to the necessity for theoretical content of these doctrines. Key doctrinal theological aspect: integration of traditional historical development, prophetic engagement with wider communities of faith, combining a sense of righteousness with justice, and so forth. So what we're talking about is, when we speak theologically, theology carries and covers certain concepts of thinking. Even though in reasoning and in conversation, we tend to lump these things together. We tend to lump them together. So we have to go back into theological practice and separate these things into their individual, independent disciplines, so we can best tackle them and see how each of these independent disciplines becomes a link in the chain that imprisons us. These historical independent seminaries were given birth to out of a particular history whereby their very existence and sustenance were dependent upon their ability to remain discreet yet functional due to their anti-establishment posture, and where such discretion was necessary for their very survival. Now, when we look at the Rastafari seminaries that were developed within the last 70, 80 years, it was developed out of a particular history. And what is this particular history? There was a time in Jamaica where there's a culture in Jamaica that is referred to as the big yard culture, especially in the urban areas of Jamaica, like Montego Bay, Kingston, Moran Bay, Portland, these larger urban centers. And as far as you can go back to the establishment of these urban centers were filled with people who were once referred to as vagabonds. People who basically were homeless, had no food, had no clothing, labored all day without any form of recompense. And at nights, they all used to gather in some form of abandoned building where they used to seek solace from their daily trials and tribulation. It is on these premises which later became known as Big Yard, where a man could come into these larger urban centers, knows no one, and he could go into this big yard and he could find somewhere to sleep. He could find commonality amongst the other people as his status or lack of status within the society. It was a place where he could seek refuge from the police. He could seek refuge from his tortured daily soul under the sun. And these premises and yards became known throughout Jamaica as the big yards. In these big yards, they still exist in Jamaica today. In those big yards, you could find people who were practicing all form of religion. You could come in these premises and find your own little corner and your own little like-minded people and engage in that which you choose to engage on these premises. You had people who were running from the law on the same premises with people who were practicing their particular African-style religion. You had people in the yard who were cooking and selling food. You had people in the yard who could come there and find someone and pay them to wash their clothes. These yards that was referred to as big yards were refuge from the larger society that persecuted them all day. Then after a time, even the early Rastafari brethren were a part of this big yard. And everyone used to come into these big yards and do whatever they felt like doing. But the common thing that they all had amongst themselves, they were able to find solace away from the daily trials and tribulation that outside that gate of that big yard. And once they step into that premises, where it was all the exploited and oppressed, find solace and comfort and peace for that night when they come in. They were able to form a certain form of respect amongst themselves, where one so-called vagabond was able to recognize the humanity within the next vagabond. A humanity that was never acknowledged or would never be acknowledged as soon as that individual crossed that threshold of that gate and goes out the next morning on the street. There is where he or she became a vagabond again. But once they come upon this property, they're once again a human being. It was here where people reasoned about Marcus Garvey through what they heard and what they saw, because the majority could not read and write. Leonard Percival Howell, that messenger of Rastafari, began in one of those yards. And it was he and his brethren who decided at some point that instead of remaining in that yard, where he had come to develop a level of consciousness where he started to see others and their activity as a form of distraction from the levels of concentration that he and his brethren wanted to do. They created a one separate space and a different compound where he and his like-minded brethren could sit in peace and tranquility and reason out the challenges that was faces the masses of the nation and the African race throughout the world, to see what evolutionary mental process they could have arrived at in order to seek liberation. Thus began, within this dispensation, the first Rastafari seminary. That seminary was named by Leonard Percival Howell the Promise Key Seminary. So we in the prison system in New York State did not originate that name. We came to the collective consciousness to resurrect that first seminary within the prison system of the state of New York and to eventually bring it out here. We are today commencing with the last program that the Rastafari Revolutionary Radio put up to recommence the Rastafari Promise Key Seminary. So that's where that name arrived from Leonard Percival Howell. At a time when the Rastafari movement, if we want to remain true, was the most potent. Yesterday's essential disposition necessary for their survival is today's threat to their relevance as well as their very existence. In order to appreciate the necessity for the fundamental reorganization of the Rastafari seminary and culture, it is best first to attain an understanding of the contextualized circumstances that gave rise to their present structure and operation by briefly touching upon how sacred documents, including the Bible and other ancient documents, and the context in which they were written, were hermetically and exegetically weaponized and deployed in justification of oppression, and the relevance of religious history and how they relate in the contextualization of faith personally, educationally, and training experiences. What this is basically saying, the way how the Rastafari seminary culture evolved, it evolved in a way where secrecy was essential. And whenever anything evolves out of secrecy, it evolves in a certain particular way that it creates bounds and restriction because of the necessity for secrecy. And that part of the seminary and culture within Rastafari is still with us today. It is still with us in so many ways. Where today, most of the Rastafari seminaries throughout the world, it's almost like you are struggling to get into a secret society, where everyone who approaches to participate is first and foremost accepted with suspicion. That is an aspect of the seminary and culture of Rastafari that evolved out of its very beginning, because the brethren from the very beginning knew that the police had a mandate to infiltrate them and to break them up and to imprison them. So when you talk about the seminary and culture within Rastafari, it is one that is formed and built around secrecy. But it was a necessity at that time. But that necessity that is formulated and built around secret, it is that which will stifle the development of the Rastafari movement today, where if we cannot become more sophisticated in how to sieve out and cipher out infiltrators, if we depend on the whole way where as a person come, you attach the suspicious and suspicion to it, then you have already defeated yourself. Because part of the security system of this world is for each and every human being to police his or herself psychologically, because the state knows that they do not have enough resources nor manpower to police each and every individual upon the face of the earth. That is an impossibility. So what does society do? It attaches a certain amount of psychological embedded fear within each and every individual. Where, even when the system is not watching you, you tell yourself that the system is watching you, and therefore you restrict your own actions and your own thinking capacity. That is the psychological warfare that is being waged. Once they are able to implant fear and suspicion amongst your own from each other. Think about that. You go to a country like China, 1.5 billion people, a police force, let's say, of 12 million police and informants. Do you believe that 12 million police and informants can control 1.5 billion people? No. In order to control that 1.5 billion people, you have to make the vast majority of that population believe that the state and its agents are all seen and always present to watch over them. That very doctrine which you can still find that was imbued in us through Christendom, the ever-seeing God, the all-present God, the God that knows what you think before you think it. Do you know how much that simple concept prevents a slave from running away? Where he believes that the slave master can always know what he thinks and what he does because of this God. Well, that Christendom type of thinking is imbued to them presently in the Rastafari movement, where we have become cramped and paralyzed because we believe that around every corner, under every stone, Babylon will detect anything that you do. So therefore, we shall not do it. Especially when we're talking about reusing technology. And sometimes when you hold reasoning with brethren and sistren, and we're not getting into whether it is truth or whether it is not. What we are really speaking about is we are bought into a belief system where we have imbued ourselves to become the police that police us for the system. But it's mind over matter. It is how you conduct and do certain things from a mental consciousness level that none of the technology can restrict and imprison you. None of them can restrict and imprison you. But as long as your thinking capacity remain in flesh and blood conceptualization, yes, you're going to cramp and paralyze yourself through your own thinking capacity. But because of what I see, and I'm going to really, let me see if I can stop right there with this. The next time we are going to get into a little historical context in order to identify the reason why we sit where we sit today, and the reason why the Rastafari Promise Key Seminary has to base itself within this historical context in order for us to get that clearer vision upon that conscious level in order to move forward. So, brethren and sisters, let's realize from these lessons on and this reasoning on forward, we are going to remove our life and our existence out of flesh and blood. This is the main objective of this Rastafari Seminary. We have already touched upon its aim and objective. We no longer have to keep spelling out the aim and objective. We dealt with that from the last reasoning. But like any good soldier, you have to be properly trained. We have to be properly trained in order to undertake this gigantic mission that awaits us. The most glorious mission that has ever been assigned to any group of human beings upon the face of this earth. We are existing in a time and amongst a people where responsibility has been placed upon our shoulders, which has become the most glorious responsibility that could have ever been assigned to any group of human beings through the existence of time. And that is, which is to liberate the African race from the shackles and chain of all other group of people upon the face of this earth. Every nation and every group and race of people upon this face of has finally come to the realization that we of the African race hold the key to the future of this earth. And whenever you and I stand before any national grouping upon the face of this earth, they have already come to know and acknowledge the fact that we have the key to their future and their very existence. We are the masters of this earth. Acknowledge it to yourself first before others will ever acknowledge it in front of you. So when I sit in front of any Babylonian, they are looking at the past, the present, and the future. And they know within their level of limited consciousness that I and my people and my race holds the key to their very existence. That key which shall be postulated through the promised key, seminary. So feel assured, man. Know your strength, know yourself, and know the journey where we are going upon. And we already pointed out, the textualization of the journey is encapsulated in them two documents, And in particular, this one here, manifested in the light, ancient order of Rastafari. You see what is encapsulated within the covers of that book here? Over 300 pages. It's a mental journey within and without where we go up and through this document. This is a particular document where individual has glanced through and has offered to purchase it even without it being published. And they never went through the whole text. They just glanced it. You see that document here? This is the foundation upon which the Rastafari Brahminic Seminary was established within the prison system. This document here. And within the folds of this document is that key and level that shall open the consciousness of this earth here. And it's not only encapsulated within the covers of this book. I have come since my release from Babylon to encounter as brethren and sisters that is of this level of consciousness. But they know for whatever particular reason they have kept that knowledge and that level of consciousness within a certain form of confinement in order for whatever reason. The establishment of the Rastafari Promised Key Seminary is at a juncture and a time where today nobody can stop it. Because it is one with the vibration and frequency of this time. And we are going to go through this entire document. We are going to lay the foundation of the seminary and the reason for the seminary and the purpose for the seminary before we commence with the actual opening of the mind of humanity, and in particularly that of the African race upon the face of the earth. And remember what I said earlier, this is in conjunction with the necessary physical aspect of liberation. Because we are not going to get tied down and bound into just preaching and teaching. No. And without any giving away what's in the future, we are presently in the process of setting up a logistic means to reach out to the world. And when the due time come and the right time come, we shall speak on it. But for now, we are going to go through the capstone, the thesis, giving the full reason why it is a necessity in this time and why it has come to play an historical role in establishing this new faculty of Rastafari, of moving away the conceptualization of Rastafari from flesh and blood and placing it within the universal consciousness of all existence. So until that time, brothers and sisters, once more, as a reminder, forged by time, this is how I try to support myself. So I do not really have to go out there and say I have to seek a job, so that job will take away from my time and effort and my mission, my life mission, to be a part of the establishment of the new faculty, that new thinking, that new level of consciousness within which Rastafari shall abide. So I need your support. Thanks for the support. And I will always ask for the support, because I really and truly want to dedicate all my time and effort to the Gillie Priest Revolutionary Radio. And most essentially, to the Tabernacle, the Rastafari Promise Key Seminary, which is a necessary establishment of an institution to really carry Rastafari into that new faculty of thinking. And not for us to keep relying upon flesh and blood form of thinking, which is the main central part of our enslavement. Where whenever Babylon wants us to fall in line, all they have to do is threaten our flesh and blood and we submit. No, we're going to move from that paradigm. We're going to move beyond the reach of Babylon, which is to integrate our concept of life within the universal consciousness of all vibration and frequency. So until next time, brothers and sisters, one love, one God, one aim, one destiny, peace, love and unity. Keep the faith. Rastafari.